Hello there, fellow friends. My name is Bernd Christian Giels, and today is Sunday, August 23rd, 2020. I am once again here recording an episode for my YouTube channel. I thank all of you, my viewers, who have patiently been awaiting my return. I am going through something of a significant transition right now in my life, with some other parts of my life changing quickly. And so it's been a bit challenging to keep all the balls in the air that I've been juggling lately. So I am going to be speaking tonight about a topic that I find of great personal interest. It is a scientific topic, so for all of you out there who are science geeks, you will most likely find this particular episode to be of interest. So this evening I am going to be speaking about something called the Anthropocene. That is spelled Anthropocene, the Anthropocene. Now, for those of you who have never heard of the term before, the Anthropocene is something that was coined quite recently by a gentleman by the name of Paul Crutzen. Actually, it was coined by both Paul Crutzen, who was a Nobel laureate, as well as Eugene Stoermer. And it was coined in the year 2000 to describe the present geological time in Earth history in which human activity has specifically profoundly altered many conditions and processes here on planet Earth. Another way to describe the Anthropocene is to describe it as the period of time in Earth's most recent geologic history in which human-influenced or anthropogenic influences are now altering major system processes throughout the world, including atmospheric, geologic, hydrologic, and biospheric processes. Now, there is some debate within the scientific community as to when the Anthropocene technically began, and obviously that would depend upon how you define what the Anthropocene is. So since we're defining it according to the period of time in which human influences began to profoundly alter Earth's processes, then you have to get a sense of what type of amount of impact has to occur before the processes are so altered that you could make the claim that humans are significantly, profoundly changing these processes. So there are various dates that have been ascribed to the start of the Anthropocene period. Some would wager that it actually began thousands of years ago during the agricultural revolution, which is understood to have occurred some 12,000 to 15,000 years ago. And at that time in human history, agriculture was indeed a profound revolutionary moment in human history, because for the first time ever in human history, human beings were beginning to settle in one place and establish agriculture as a regular practice, and therefore, in a sense, profoundly changing the way they related to the earth. So some would wager that the actual emergence of human agriculture is when the Anthropocene started. Others would say that it began as recently as the 1960s. Now you can look at various processes that occur throughout the world and then assess the particular impact of humans on those processes as a means of trying to determine a start date. For example, you could argue that according to atmospheric processes, the Anthropocene began when the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere began to radically change in terms of its concentration from pre-industrial levels. Now, the Industrial Revolution occurred, as I understand it, about 17, 18 decades ago in the middle of the 19th century. And what happened was we began to radically change the chemistry of our atmosphere by emitting large quantities of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And in so doing, we have changed the heat-trapping properties of the atmosphere. thereby ultimately today in our present time beginning to radically change the weather patterns that we observe throughout the world. Now, if you were to look at other processes, other parts of the Earth system, like the oceans and the hydrologic cycle, for example, you could argue that the Anthropocene began much earlier than the Industrial Revolution when we began to radically change the atmosphere. By that I mean, if you think about the ways that we have diverted water and water bodies throughout our human history, we have been doing that sort of thing for a long time, even going back to the invention of agriculture when we first began to use different processes to sustain ourselves. So once we invented agriculture, we had to become more attuned, in a sense, to the weather patterns that would impact our success in farming. And so, in a sense, if you look at the hydrologic cycle, you could argue that we have been in the Anthropocene period for a very long time relative to when we began to radically change the atmosphere of planet Earth. So my point in sharing these particular ideas of these different Earth systems is to simply underscore how you can make an argument that the Anthropocene began at any number of times in human history. But regardless of when you agree that it began, it is basically, as I understand it now, pretty much a scientific consensus that we are most definitely in the Anthropocene now in the 21st century. We now have over 7 billion human beings alive on the planet at one time. We have developed radically impressive technologies that heretofore did not exist as recently as just a few decades ago. For example, the revolution in mobile communications technology, cell phones and the like. This is something that did not occur until about the last 20 to 30 years. I'm old enough to remember when we had the old school phones that you actually had plugged into a wall. And I have watched with great amusement when I have seen younger people encounter the rotary phones of even older years past. When I was a kid and my grandparents were still alive living in the state of Arkansas, I can remember that my grandmother had a rotary phone in part of the house. And so you would literally have to use your finger and make a circular motion to dial the numbers of the phone exchange that you were seeking to reach. And so we have witnessed vast transformations occurring because of our rapid development of technology. And these technologies have radically changed our lives in many parts of our lives, whether it's how we eat, whether it's how we communicate with one another, whether it is how we transport ourselves and goods and services throughout the planet. We have seen a proliferation of technologies that have not only radically changed how we live in relation to each other, but also how we live in relation to the planet Earth itself. And so this concept of the Anthropocene, I think, is a worthy concept to use to initiate a dialogue about how we think about our place in the world and how we have so radically changed our sense of our place in the world due to the fact that we have become such a successful species that we now number in the billions and can do things such as break open an atom, develop nanotechnology, and even send people to the moon and beyond. So the reason I wanted to discuss the Anthropocene is because as a scientist, specifically as an earth scientist who studied atmospheric science as an undergraduate student, I am very, very concerned about the pace at which we are loading our atmosphere with greenhouse gases and continuing to enhance the heat trapping capacity of the atmosphere. And this has specifically been on my mind in recent days and weeks and months because we are, in this country, the United States of America, facing multiple crises. We are facing a global health crisis with the COVID-19 pandemic. We are facing an employment crisis as unemployment remains persistently high, even though some parts of the economy have begun to function better than they did months ago when lockdowns were first introduced in this country. So it has been a growing concern to me also because of other crises. For example, we're facing crises of leadership in this country. And we're facing a crisis, I would say, of our sense of accountability to one another as American citizens. Never in my lifetime do I recall a time when there was such vitriol and hatred and antagonism and recklessness as there is in our current political moment in this country. I don't recall a time in which we were so antagonistic towards one another, in which there was so much hatred and indifference to the suffering of our fellow American citizens. And I see that reflected in the discourse and the language that is being used now, specifically within political discourse in this country. I find it very concerning that so many Americans appear to be so indifferent to the suffering of other people, other American citizens and non-citizens, immigrants, undocumented immigrants, and the like. And I appreciate the valid points that are made about the burden that can be placed upon our systems in this country when undocumented immigrants come here to try to build a better life for themselves and end up using services that are provided in this country without paying taxes. I completely appreciate the point, and it's a very valid point to make. Nonetheless, what concerns me now is the level of animosity and hatred and dysfunction in our country. And on that note, a very concerning data point that I saw today in the media was a report on the percentage of people identifying as Democrats or Republicans who consider the current COVID-19 death toll to be a, quote, acceptable death toll. And what the data showed was that a majority of those identifying as Republicans apparently consider the current death toll, which is approaching 180,000 Americans, to be an acceptable death toll. Whereas a minority, a very small minority of Democrats felt that way. Now, I am not sharing this particular data point to make it sound as if I think the Democrats are infallible and are better than the Republican Party, and that Democrats, people who vote for the Democratic Party, have necessarily the moral high ground in matters of great urgency in this country. That is not my purpose in sharing that one piece of data. In sharing that, what I'm trying to illustrate is the sad current moment we find ourselves in, where we have come to accept a death toll approaching 200,000 Americans as an acceptable death toll. 200,000 Americans is larger than the population of many, many, many small towns, and even slightly larger than small towns throughout this country. There are any number of communities that are smaller than that. And so basically we have lost enough Americans such that it's the equivalent of wiping out an entire town of 180,000 people. Consider the towns in this country that have about that population size. And so the reason that I'm sharing this in relation to the Anthropocene is that I think that part of what the problem is that we are experiencing in this country is a certain dissociative cultural phenomenon in which we have become alienated from one another and alienated from the planet Earth itself to such a degree that we can feel as if we are not being inappropriate or unkind or cruel by ignoring the pain and suffering and hunger and thirst and deprivation of our fellow American citizens. I find it very worrisome that we have reached this point. And I find it worrisome also because my own ancestry already went through the horror of fascism, the horror of a nation state descending into something akin to a psychological madness in which a nation state devolves to the point that authoritarianism has become a way of life that is preferred by a minority and tolerated by a majority, to the point that it takes root and leads a people deeply astray. Sadly, when my German grandfather was still alive, I did not learn as much about his history, his own personal life history, as I now wish that I had, including the era of the Nazi regime in Germany, in which he was sent to fight on the Eastern Front in Russia. So my ancestry has gone through the experience of a nation state imploding to the point that it becomes an aggressor, invades its neighboring nations, and then must be itself invaded to purge this very dark, destructive political system that led in part to the death of millions of the Jewish people and many more people dying, not more literally than 6 million people, but many others dying in the actual conflict of World War II. And so as a man of German American heritage, whose mother is a German citizen, I find it very worrisome that America seems to be going down a road that isn't identical, certainly, to what Germany traveled in the 1930s, but has eerie parallels to that historic period in the country of Germany. And so, as to what the answer is to that, how to step back from the brink and how to live in the Anthropocene geologic era, that is an open question that you and I and all of us are living every day. How can we and should we live in this current moment, both here in the United States of America and throughout the world, as the world as a whole faces a common threat, namely this coronavirus pandemic. This virus has spread to all 6 continents, and I am not aware of what the status is of any research activities or expeditions that might be going on in Antarctica. So I can't say whether the coronavirus has actually gone to that 7th continent of the 7. But as for the other 6, the coronavirus has spread throughout the world. And it is alarming to me how much indifference there is, apparently, to the deaths of nearly 180,000 American citizens. And one of the things that I think the media still doesn't get too accurate or doesn't portray too well is the very real truth that the damage from this pandemic is far greater than those 180,000, approximately now, 180,000 Americans who have died. For every person who dies in this country of the coronavirus, there are many more who were deeply connected to them through marriage, through being parents or being children, through their professional jobs that they held. There are many, many connections that these dead Americans had to their fellow Americans, and those connections are being severed. Every day that passes, that more Americans and more people throughout the world die from this virus is just more rending of the social fabric both within our country and throughout the world. every death is a tragic death when it's a completely preventable, needless death. Whether it's a small child who could have lived 80, 90 years and become an amazing doctor, or whether it's people in their 70s and 80s who have lived most of their lifespans but who still contribute to their communities by volunteering, by taking care of their grandchildren, or whether it's people in the prime of their lives who have both children and parents, and perhaps they take care of both of those generations, or whether it's people like I was alluding to who have very prominent, important, powerful jobs, who were doctors and lawyers and artists and writers and all the other people. Because in no way should we minimize the contributions of people who have been doing jobs that did not require large amounts of education. Whether it's a janitor, a police officer, a doctor, a lawyer, an artist, a kindergarten teacher, a salesperson, a customer service representative, a pizza delivery driver, every single life, as I was taught, has dignity and worth. And though I did grow up being raised Catholic, I was not someone who actually went to Catholic school. But despite the fact that I had a public school education and I was not thoroughly exposed to Catholic teaching in my formal primary education, I still developed a sense of the imperative that we all have dignity and worth. And so it saddens me greatly to see the amount of hatred and vitriol that is being shared within the body politic in this country. And it's, in a sense, sadly reminiscent of what is happening to some of the people who are actually dying of the coronavirus, not so much because of the virus itself, but because in some cases the virus results in an overly activated immune system that then attacks the body itself. And so just as some people are dying of COVID-19 because of their immune response, so some members of the American populace, of the American population, are dying due to the poisonous impact of the behavior of their fellow American citizens. And this year we have seen, among other things, the reality that there is still an extensive amount of racism and bigotry and misogyny in this country, even now in the year 2020. I was not alive in the 1960s to witness the upheavals of the 1960s and the dramatic forward progress that was made in equal rights, rights for women, rights for people of color, rights for the LGBTQ community, of which I am a member. I was not alive to witness those times. But what we have today now, in 2020, from what I can understand, is very reminiscent of those turbulent times. It is as disruptive and as anxiety-provoking, I would wager, as the 1960s were, as World War II was, as the economic crash of 1929 was, as World War I was to the heart and soul of Europe. So, that is pretty much what I wanted to share in this episode. I wanted to introduce the concept of the Anthropocene and then bring in this connection between the Anthropocene and how we, I believe, are living in a way of being, certainly in the developed world, in which we have baked in a sense, a dissociated way of relating to one another and to the natural world. And for those of you who are finding me through this video as your first introduction to my channel, I highly recommend that you go through my Top Influencers series and check out my first posting, my first top influencer, my top influencer, Dr. Pamela Colorado, in which I speak about the mentoring I experienced as one of many students who studied under her direction. And you take the time to learn about her teachings, the teachings of indigenous science. Look up the Worldwide Indigenous Science Network and look up the episode in which I honor her as my top influencer. It's one of the first in the first 10 episodes of my YouTube channel. So in future episodes, I will allude to the Anthropocene as this framework in which we are living on planet Earth in the early 21st century. By no means do I think there is any doubt, any real serious opposition in the scientific community that we're certainly living in the Anthropocene era by, I would say, yes, the 1960s or 70s, or certainly the 80s maybe at the very latest. Like I said, you can look at this from so many angles according to the different Earth systems that you think about. So, on that note, I'm going to close. I appreciate all of you, my viewers, who have been waiting for me to produce more content. I am going to continue to be producing content to the best of my ability. And as this channel grows, and as I have more time and produce more content, I welcome your feedback. I welcome you to use this channel as a meeting place to have meaningful, respectful, and thoughtful dialogue with one another. I am not at this time planning to moderate my channel extensively, meaning I am not going to plan to moderate comments made between people who might find my channel and have radically different viewpoints on things. I am here more as someone focused on inspiring dialogue by the provision of my content rather than moderating and directing the communications that are made in response to what I share. Now, perhaps that will change in the future and I'll have the time and the interest to moderate, but at this time that is not something that I am planning to do. I am planning to continue to produce content fairly regularly, hopefully 5 to 6 episodes per week. And I will continue to produce episode in alignment with my mission, which I will repeat here, is to inspire, educate, and entertain my viewers. So, thank you again, everyone, for watching. I welcome you to tell your friends, family, colleagues, and your pets about me, because even pets can be entertained by well-made YouTube videos. It's Sunday night. You all have a great night and a great week, and I will be back most likely tomorrow with new content. And thank you again for your interest and your loyal viewership.